this was my view when we walked out of the school building on Wednesday. You can see up here on the screen, we had lots of rain, and the canal began to overflow in front of our school area. And so, yeah, it was pretty deep. And so, a lot of things that were going on. And one of the students from our middle school came up to me, and I guess they just know me all too well. He walks up to me and says, "Pastor Dan, how are you going to use this in your sermon on Sunday?" And I thought, am I just that transparent? Is that, man, I do these things and they know me all so well. So anyway, you can see we had one of the guys who, I don't know if he was a school parent or whatever, but actually went out to wade out in the road right here in front. And as cars were coming through, there were many times he would look out, he'd say, "Stop, no, turn around. And so many of those cars were able to turn around and go back the other way. What a day. But as I thought about this, I said, maybe I should talk about Jesus walking on the water. But then I said, you know what? Let's continue in our time of talking about going through trials. We've been going through trials. And so when I saw this man out there telling folks to turn around, there were a few folks that listened, and then he kind of came back towards the parking lot. And then there were a few folks that thought about it. You could see the wheels turn. They kind of came up to the water. Some of them might have had bigger vehicles and things like that, but they weren't able to make it through. Some were able to make it through. Here's one. I don't know if you can kind of see in the far left corner. You can see that car in the far left corner that thought about it, and they took the risk and weren't able to make it all the way through. And so the problem is when we have the storms of life. When we have storms and we have the storms of life, I want you to think about those cars. Storms of life present opportunities that never would have happened had that storm not come up. Had that storm not come up, no one would have said, can I drive through this road? They just would have gone through the road, right? But when the storms happen, then sometimes decisions have to be made. There's risk involved. And you say, man, this is a good decision. This is a wise decision. Or sometimes the decision pops up and you say, well, this is not a wise decision. And in many cases, when the storms of life are present, then also that opportunity presents itself for a decision to be made. And in some cases, like this car, some of those decisions have sinking consequences. Sometimes those decisions have, as we're going to be talking about today, sinful consequences. When things aren't going well in your marriage, you may be tempted to do something stupid. When things aren't going well in your relationship with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, maybe you aren't married here today, but things aren't going well and you may be tempted to do something stupid. In the midst of that storm that is going on, there's decisions that have to be made. When you're sick at home, and you're trying to recover. Maybe you've been laying in bed one day and you had to take off work. And you're going to be tempted with a decision. What am I going to watch on television? What am I going to do? Am I going to watch trash on television? Or am I going to watch something that's edifying? In the midst of that storm of being sick. When tax season comes along, you say, Pastor Dan, don't talk about that. I know what tomorrow is. When tax season comes along, you may be tempted to fudge the numbers in the midst of that storm. When you are grieving or you are stressed and you are in the midst of that storm, you may be tempted to make a sinful or unwise decision of using drugs or using alcohol as your coping mechanism. And so as we think about this today, and as Anthony mentioned this, he stole a little bit of my thunder, but I appreciate that. If you're taking a few notes today, maybe that you just write this on the side of your notes. If we're going to talk about integrity, what is integrity? It's doing the right thing when no one else is looking. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one else is looking. And this has been the battle even since the very first sin. I was thinking about this. I said, when Adam and Eve were standing there by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and Satan is tempting them, there was no one else. No one else had been created. No other babies had been born at that point in time. No one else is around to say this is a good idea or a bad idea. And so I want you to hear this, that this is not anything new that we're talking about today. This integrity is a topic that goes all the way back to the beginning of time. But integrity and not making an impulsive or sinful decision is especially important when you are in the midst of a trial, when you are going through your own storm. And Joseph was certainly going through a storm. As we've been talking about the story of Joseph, I want you to hear the story of Joseph is one of those incredible stories of a man of God who just lived it out despite the high highs and the low lows. And so Joseph had been sold by his brothers. You remember from last week, he was the favorite of his father. And so his brothers lived in a blended family, by the way, had 4 different moms between all the brothers, and they hated him. And so they sold him into slavery. At first they wanted to kill him, but they decided Reuben, the oldest brother, kind of saved his life, and they wound up selling him into slavery. And so now the Ishmaelites, who they sold him to, they're traveling salespeople, if you will, and now they're going down into Egypt, if you know the story. And so that's where we're going to pick up. So if you got your Bible this morning, we're going to start out in Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 1. And it says this, it says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. And when he did that, Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, he was the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites and who had taken him there." So just a picture of what this might have looked like. This is my AI pictures that sometimes I'm able to make with these things. And so you can imagine, so here is Joseph. He's being brought to the marketplace of Egypt. And so he's been taken there, and now he is bought by Potiphar. But don't miss this. Look right with me in verse 2. It says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered." In the midst of the storm, we're going to talk about this more in just a second. In the midst of the storm, God is still with Joseph. And I want you to hear this. No matter what you may be facing today, no matter what you might be going through today, no matter what storm or trial or whatever, God is with you in the midst of the storm. And so there, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And here's what I want you to understand. Even when you're in the midst of the trial and God has his hand on you, let me tell you something. You begin to bless the people that are around you. When you live for God, no matter what the trial is, you begin to bless those people that are around you. That's for free. That's not part of our notes today. And look at this. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, check this out in verse 4. It says, "Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant, and Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned." And so perhaps it looked maybe a little bit like this, where Potiphar has now put him in everything that is owned, and Potiphar is just sitting back right there in the recliner. He's playing with his kids. He can do whatever he wants. He can do whatever business that he wants, because now his family is in charge with Joseph. And so all of this time has taken place. And then in verse 5, it says, "From the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph." The blessing of the Lord was on everything that Potiphar had in the house and in the field. So I want you to gather this, is that it's not just in the house. Certainly he's put him in charge of everything in the house. He's managing everything, but also in the field. So he's going out, he's handling things. He's in charge of some of the economic prosperity of Potiphar, things that are going on in the field, the servants out in the field. So he's put him in charge of all these things, and he's prospering. And then we get into verse 6. And it says, "So he left in Joseph's care everything that he had, with Joseph in charge, and he did not concern himself with anything," look at this, "except the food he ate." Joseph could have said, "You know what? I'm going to do the bare minimum. I don't deserve this. My brothers, they treated me so wrong. They've left me in this horrible position. He could have been lazy. He could have thought to himself, I'm in the midst of the storm. God, I can't believe that you've done this to me. Everything that I've learned about you, and now I feel like you've turned your back on me, God. He could have done that, but he didn't do that. And so what I want you to see this morning, if you've got those notes, is that integrity is possible no matter what situation that you might face. And the first thing that we can learn from the story of Joseph is for you and for I to be faithful where we are. Be faithful where we are. Can I ask you this morning, if you're in the storm, are you in a job that you hate? Are you in a job that you hate? Be faithful where you are. Are you maybe you're a student here today. Do you have a class or do you have a teacher that you just can't stand? Maybe that you've got calculus or in my case, geometry. Man, I hated geometry. And I'm good at math. I hated geometry. Hated that entire semester that I had to take geometry. Are you faithful to learn the things that you need to learn? Are you sick a lot? And you say, look, my health has been up and down. My health has been all over the place. Are you faithful even in the midst of being sick? Are you in a broken relationship and you have the opportunity to go crazy? That broken relationship, that storm has let you down and you have the opportunity to do everything wrong, and probably no one would get in your face and say, you know what, everything that they're doing is as a result of how they were treated. But are you still being faithful regardless of the storm of that relationship? Are you being faithful where you are? Have your kids wandered from the truth? Have your kids been wandering? And are you still being faithful where you are? And we must be faithful to God and be faithful where He has placed us. As the New Testament said, as the Apostle Paul said, that we work for God, not for man. We work for God. So when you go through these things, think of Joseph in this situation. He says, you know what? I don't work for Potiphar. I work for God. And so I'm going to be faithful where I am. This spreads out. How good is your work ethic? Do you have a good work ethic? But do you work for God and not for man? Do you give God your best? And here's the temptation. Is when we go through these storms, when we go through these trials, the temptation's going to look like this. Are you ready? God, I've tried it your way, and look where it got me. God, I tried it your way. I tried to be faithful. I tried to, and look where it got me. That's going to be the temptation. That's what Satan is going to whisper in your ear. And Joseph could have done the minimum requirement, but he was faithful where God planted him. Remember, we're talking about growing all year long. He was faithful where God planted him. His responsibility, and God blessed. God blessed it, and He will bless you if you are faithful where you are. The second thing that I want you to write down is that integrity is possible no matter what situation you face, but you've got to avoid temptation. Avoid temptation. Now, temptation is everywhere. Anthony was talking about pornography, talking about all those different things. Man, I don't know about you. Every time I open up my phone, every time I'm on social media, there's something out there that is related, that is tempting me. I mean, it's hard to get away from temptation. And so when you are in the middle of the storms of life, you don't have to go searching for sin. Sin will find you. And so I want you to think about this. Here is Joseph. He's far from home. Now, granted, it wasn't his choice, but he's far from home. No mom, no dad, no brothers, no friends. And he is in a brand new environment. And can I just talk to you this morning? This is where temptation is the most fierce. It is the most fierce when you go away and where there is no one around that you used to know. Students, I'm going to tell you a little secret that when you move out of the house, no matter if you go to school or maybe you just go into the workforce, when you move out of the house, that's when the temptations are the most fierce. Is because now there's no curfew, there's no rules. It's just you and God. And the question will come up, am I going to own my faith? Or is that just something I did when I lived in mommy and daddy's house? And the same is true for us as adults. When we think about this, when we take the new job, when we go somewhere else, I want you to hear this. The people that they don't know you. And the temptation is that much more fierce when you're not in a place where people know you. And so that's when you find out who you really are. The tests now are child's play compared to when you move out and when you go someplace new. Let's see what happens in the life of Joseph. So it says right here in the latter part of verse 39, it says, "Now Joseph was well built and handsome." I don't think he was part of the lifting team, but he was well built and he was handsome. And it says, "And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, 'Come to bed with me.'" Now, we don't know Potiphar's wife's name. We know a lot of scandalous women in the Bible and we know their names, but we don't even know her name. All we know is that temptation has found Joseph. And she looks at him and she said, "You are far away from home. No one's around. My husband's not around. You need to come to bed with me." But look at him. Even in the midst of this, he had integrity. In verse 8, it says, "But he refused." This is what he says. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care." So he said, "Listen, I'm not going to do that. I would be going against my master. I'd be going against your husband." Now check this out in verse 9. He says, "No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." And then don't miss this. This is so important. I've got it highlighted for you. "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And this is where the rubber meets the road. Is my faith in God a bunch of rules that I'm supposed to follow? Or is it a relationship that I have with him? And notice what he said. He began to say, "How could I do this wicked thing against your husband?" But then ultimately he says, "How can I do this wicked thing against God?" See, it's not just against people, it's also against God. Because God's there when no one's looking. God's there. He sees everything. And that's where we're going to find out the true position of our heart. Is this just a bunch of rules? Or do I genuinely have a relationship with God? Is he my father? Is he my heavenly father? Is he my best friend? Do I not want to let my best friend down? Do I not want my God disappointed in me? That's where the rubber meets the road. And that's exactly what happens with Joseph. He says, "I'm not just doing this so that I can, so I don't want to break these rules. I would be sinning against Almighty God. He's my creator. He's my sustainer. I love him with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. I'm not going against him." And then it kept happening. It says, "And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her." He avoided temptation. Men, women in the room, I'm telling you, you got to avoid temptation. When that thing pops up on your phone, when that thing pops up on a billboard, when that person presents themselves, you've got to avoid them like the plague. When you give it an inch, it will take a mile. You've got to avoid temptation. The third thing that I want you to write down is that integrity is possible no matter what situation you face. And you've got to be courageous in persecution. You've got to be courageous in persecution. So now the ante goes up. When you are in the midst of the storm and you make decisions to follow God, are things going to go your way? Things will go your way, right? Wrong. Sometimes when you are in the midst of the storm and you say, "God, I'm going to follow you." Now, don't get me wrong. God had made him prosperous and economically and things like that. But there are going to be times that you are wholeheartedly sold out to God and you're thinking, okay, surely things are going to go my way. And they don't. And you've got to be courageous when they go wrong. Just because you're doing things God's way when you're in the storm doesn't mean that you're not going to get wet. You've got to be courageous. And so we can see right here, as we see in verse 11, it says, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. Now, I don't know if this just caught him off guard. I don't know if he just went in not knowing, but I think there's some wisdom in here. If you want to, again, go back to the last point and avoid temptation, you need to put yourself around other people. You've got to be around other people. You can't do it all by yourself. And so here he is. He goes into the house for whatever reason. He's all alone. There she is. And then look at what happens. It says she caught him by the cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and he ran out of the house. This goes back to what the Apostle Paul tells us out of 1 Corinthians. He tells us to flee sexual immorality. He says, every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sin sexually sins against his own body. You've got to flee and get away from that stuff. So whether it's pornography or whether it's dirty movies or whether it's books, ladies, I know that, 50 Shades of Nasty, whatever it is, you like that, didn't you? All right, use that. So whatever that stuff is, you've got to get away from it. You've got to flee the same way that Joseph fled from it. When I was in my senior year of college, there's a beautiful girl that I had met my freshman year, and one night, so I'd met her my freshman year. This is 4 years later. She had gone off. She had done some school on the other side of the ocean. She had gone to London and things like that. And she had come back, and this was in my senior year. And one night, it was the first night we had hung out in years and years and years. It was just good to see her. And she said, let's go back to my apartment. And I looked back at her and I said, let's not. And she said, let's go. Yeah, you like that, don't you? I don't know how we're going to get it through today, but it's going to be great. I said, let's not. It made it awkward. It was awkward. And in those moments, let me tell you something. In those moments that you choose to be courageous and you choose to take a stand, let me tell you things are going to get real awkward real fast. Because the rest of the night got awkward from that moment on. And so you've got to keep that in. It's going to get real awkward. And I look back on that night and it got awkward. But let me tell you something. I have no regrets. I have no regrets. And so here she is. She grabs him by the cloak. Look what happens in verse 13. So she's got the cloak. He runs out of the house. And then in verse 13, now she's embarrassed. Things are awkward, just like I talked about. She called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. Ladies and gentlemen, is that what happened? That's not what happened. But here she is. He's done the right thing and she lied about it. And we have no idea what amount of time went by. You can see in verses 14 and 15, it says, when he heard me scream for help, the lie continues. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Is that what happened? No, that's not what happened. He ran to get out of there. He ran to be faithful to God. He ran to be faithful to Potiphar. And so here he is. He's a righteous man. And she is lying about him. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. And that could have been a couple of hours, could have been a couple of days. But can you imagine being Joseph in this situation thinking, Potiphar, my master, is going to come back and all of this is getting ready to hit the fan. It could have been an enormous amount of time. When you are in the midst of the storm, there will be times, listen to me, there will be times that you will do the right thing. And you are the only person, you are the only person that knows that you're pleasing God. That's just leadership 101. There will be times that following God gets you pain. And you've got to be courageous the way Joseph was. Be a man of integrity, be a woman of integrity in the midst of persecution. And I think being lied about is one of the telltale signs. She had the position of the wife, and so her word trumped his. He couldn't even give his side of the story. And let me tell you something, that may happen to you. It may happen at work. It may happen in the court system. I don't know if anyone's ever threatened to sue you. They've threatened to sue me. I mean, and you're like, I've done everything right. I've done everything to honor God, and people will still threaten all types of things. And they will lie about you. I think the lie is the telltale sign that you're in God's will. Because that's their last strategy against you, is just to lie. And you've got to be courageous in the midst of persecution. I'll never forget, years ago, there was one situation. I was at a church and I was new at the church, and there were people there that just didn't like change. They just didn't like it. They didn't like that a person had come in and as a minister, and that it felt like they were losing power. And I'll never forget that there were people that said, Pastor Dan is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I had to deal with that lie person to person. You just got to be courageous in the midst of persecution sometimes. So I want you to think about that. The next thing that I want us to see, as we skip down into verse 20, it says, Joseph's master, man, he was mad. And he put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But don't miss this. Don't miss this in verse 21. In verse 21, it says, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Do you see this? No matter where he goes, no matter what he does, the Lord is with him. He showed his kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And so if you got the last bit of your notes here today, I want you to write this down. Integrity is possible no matter what situation you face with E. Endurance in affliction. Endurance in affliction. Again, Joseph could have thrown up his hands. He could have cussed God. He could have sulked, but he had integrity. And you know what I find? This isn't in the notes, but I just want to throw this out there. Do you know that anytime that I find that things like that are happening in my life, God is setting me up for something big. And God was setting up Joseph for something big. Now, he doesn't know this. He has no idea. He is completely in the dark. But God is setting him up to be the second leader in Egypt, just under Pharaoh. He has no idea. And I want you to be reminded today, when all these tests begin to come in the midst of the storm, God is testing your faithfulness. He's testing your integrity, probably because there's something on the horizon that you can't see, but that He is getting you prepared for. And you can throw your hands up and you can cuss God and you can do all those things. But nevertheless, I want you to hear this. You need to have endurance in the midst of affliction, because He's probably setting you up for something great. Nevertheless, I see this, sometimes I see people and they'll one of their favorite verses is Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I've shared this with you guys before. I know football teams that have quoted that before running out on the field. I have known people who have quoted it before interviewing for a job promotion. I've known students who have quoted Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, before they take a test. I was one of them. But when Paul said it, remember, he was sitting in a jail cell, enduring, waiting, persevering. You see, I want you to see this key truth. I'm going to put it up here on the screen, and I'm going to explain it to you, okay? God's strength doesn't give you the victory. God's strength is the victory. Let me explain that. God's strength doesn't give you the victory. It is a victory. What do I mean by that? Our victory as believers isn't found in what we achieve. You need to hear that. Your victory is not found in what you achieve. Our victory as believers is in the very presence and power of God Himself in our lives. So let me tell you something. If we could use the story of Joseph and his integrity, Joseph isn't just sitting in a jail cell. He is sitting in a victorious jail cell because God is with him. And you need to think about that. It's not worldly success that is victory. It is not money that is victory. It's not fame that's victory. It's not prestige that is victory. We have to redefine, as Christians, listen to me. We've got to redefine victory. It's not just overcoming the obstacle. It's the presence and power of God in the midst of the obstacle. You can have victory in the midst of the obstacle. And that's exactly what happened with Joseph. I just want to put this up here on the screen one more time. Genesis 39, verse 21. We looked at it just a second ago. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. Don't miss the victory. As we get ready to close today, I've helped many people through all kinds of storms. All kinds of storms. I've gone to pray with all kinds of people as their health was waning. And perhaps even as they were getting into the twilight weeks of their life. Perhaps they know that their days are numbered. And there was one person a year ago that I went to go see, Sarah Bouvier's daddy. His name is Ted Gramillion. And he wasn't able to leave the house. But he watched our time of worship every single Sunday, didn't he, Sarah? And I knew that because when I went to go visit him, he would tell me the points of my sermon. And it's crazy when people know him better than you do. And so here he was. He's telling me the points of all my sermon. And I heard about his health, and I went to go visit him. And to be honest with you, if I could be completely honest with you, Sarah, I put on my ministry face. You know how you put it on your ministry face? And I was ready to encourage him with some scriptures. And I was ready to have some words of peace. And I will never forget that experience as long as I live. I went to encourage him, but by the time I left, he had encouraged me. He had so much joy. The twilight of his life had so much joy. He had so much faith. And he was cracking jokes with me. And I'm not saying that, cracking jokes is, neither this or that, but it was a way that the joy of the Lord was able to come through his life. He was telling me, even in those last days, he was telling me things that God was teaching him. He wasn't, and as I thought about that, I thought, it wasn't any type of medication that he was on. It was genuinely the power of the Holy Spirit coming through this man. And I have been in enough deathbed situations to know that and experience, things that are natural. But folks, let me hear you. That was supernatural, what was coming out of him. The truth was, he was going to die. He was in the midst of a storm. But the truth was, the Lord was with him. And he was getting ready to meet Jesus face to face. And ladies and gentlemen, it showed. It showed. In the midst of the storm, he had integrity. In the midst of the storm, he had Jesus. In the midst of the storm, he had victory. And when you're in the storm, let me just say this one more time before we close. Your victory is not in the outcome. The victory is in God's presence and in God's power. Be a man, be a woman of integrity. And just as Anthony said, walk with him. When you're walking with him, it will naturally come out. Sometimes we get in those moments of bondage. I get that. But God wants you to walk in victory, and He wants you to walk in integrity. So let's do it.